Well, Jim, it's been a great day. We've been across a big cross-section of CD1 today and holding some media events and a lunch and now this a town hall forum. You're hearing about a ton of issues from people, one of which I know is national security. And foreign policy. What are you hearing from people and how are you addressing it?
Well, Pete, it's been a pleasure to have you here in southern Minnesota, especially the Rochester area campaign. I tell you, just having you, there's a lot of energy with our supporters, and I appreciate your time. But I think a lot of people realize that some of the international relations problems that we have, even here in the United States, where it's all coming out of the Middle East. And a lot of it is because of these Obama Walls policies that they pursued over the years. And with my opponent, Tim Walz, he's so liberal and wrong on foreign policy. He was even against the surge when President Bush pulled that off, said it was too much for the troops, couldn't get it done. Then he was for some of these other things like pulling the troops out of Iraq expeditiously, no status of forces agreement to preserve the peace that you, the fine soldiers of our country and others had attained. And then you get into things like undermining Egypt, undermining Yemen, the transition in Libya, which was Clinton's war. Walz voted for all that stuff. And boy, it's been just a surge of Islamic terrorism, refugee problems, loss of U.S. prestige, and unfortunately the slaughter of Christians.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You mentioned, and you mentioned refugees, you mentioned the chaos that has led to that. Here in Minnesota, it's an issue that some candidates and policymakers have been willing to talk about, some have not. You've made it more of a centerpiece of your campaign and willingness to talk about it. Yeah. Why and how have you talked about what that means?
Well, about a year ago, I remember when there was especially a lot of problems with Islamic terrorism, refugees from places like Somalia. And here in Minnesota, we're kind of ground zero for that. Our own U.S. Attorney, Andrew Lugar, an appointee of President Obama in the Justice Department, he said that Minnesota has a terrorist recruiting problem. And I looked at that and thought, well, maybe we should do something about the refugee program. Maybe we should take a time out. So we put that policy out there about a year ago. We received a little bit of flack from the left, but it was the right thing to do. I think at this point in time, it's very critical that we make sure that the people coming to America, particularly from countries that don't like America, are going to become good Americans. And so that's why we put it out there.
And one of the reasons a refugee, there's different refugee crisis or flows. One of them most recently is from ISIS, and they've created, as you talked about, the surge worked, and then we pulled out, and Walz and Obama were for both of those things. Sowed the seeds of chaos, then we didn't reinforce a red line in Syria, and you've got this massive refugee push. How should America be addressing a threat like ISIS and radical Islam more holistically? I mean, what should we be doing to prevent that threat from spreading?
Well, as far as the foreign policy is concerned, I'm a Reagan guy, so I like the idea of peace through strength, that concept. And what it would mean in the Middle East is we should be for stable governments. We should make sure that if we're involved over there, that we have some goals for those governments. And they may be democratic governments, they may be not so democratic governments. But we should want them to be stable, to try to be as benevolent to their people as possible, to provide as much liberty for religious freedom as possible, to keep the free flow of oil moving, and to align with the West in some capacity in order to fight the Islamic terrorists. If we could accomplish those goals, just in a general sense, we'd be much better off than we are today.
Mm-hmm. Some of the confusion of the Obama years has been, it feels like we treat our allies differently and our enemies differently. What does America need to do, in your mind, to reestablish America's credibility with our allies and also with our enemies who feel like they're kind of able to run roughshod on us?
Well, I think it gets back to Reagan again. I mean, look at what President Reagan accomplished when he destroyed and defeated the Soviet Union without firing a shot. We had peace through strength. We built up our army and military to a point where nobody wanted to challenge us in that way. And he was able to defeat our enemies, project out U.S. values around the world, defend and support our allies, and we didn't commit any ground troops anywhere for any prolonged time. And that, to me, is good leadership. I think it requires a new president, frankly. I mean, there's only so much one member of Congress or even the legislative branch can do. This is an executive position for executive leadership, and that's why I so strongly support Donald Trump for president, because we've seen what Hillary Clinton's all about. And I know you have a lot of experience in this, and I don't think we want 4 years of that.
Sure. Well, speaking of what 4 more years would mean, one of the issues we talked about today was Guantanamo Bay. And certainly Hillary Clinton would continue the policies of Barack Obama. What is take an issue like Guantanamo, the closure of Guantanamo Bay, how it could affect people? I know that's something you've talked a little bit about as well.
Well, I'm running against the most liberal congressman in the history of southern Minnesota, Tim Walz. And from almost day one when he was in office, he decided that he wanted to close Guantanamo Bay. He's been voting that way along the way. And I said, I don't understand it. I mean, I think you're someone with some experience down Guantanamo Bay, so maybe you can help me out. But Walz wants to close the place, and the press 7 years ago asked him, said, well, gee, what's going to happen to the terrorists and some of the worst people in the world, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11 down there? You bring them into the United States for civilian trial. And now they're in the federal system. Where are they going to end up? And someone said, what if they end up in Rochester's Federal Medical Center, where we visited today? And the congressman actually said, well, if you make certain precautions, the professionals there can handle it. I mean, can you believe it? A United States congressman inviting the terrorists into his own district is unheard of. And I think this is very naive. We don't need Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. We don't need these terrible jihadists 2 miles from downtown Rochester. We don't need them in southern Minnesota. We don't need them in our country. And I always say the difference between Tim Walz and myself is Walz wants to give the Islamic terrorists Miranda rights. I want to give them the last rights and protect our country.
Well said. Speaking of well said, I have had the privilege of interviewing most of the Republican presidential candidates in this cycle. Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Carly Fiorina, Dr. Ben Carson, in settings just like this, one-on-one town halls across the country. And I've sat with a lot of congressmen in the same setting. But I will say, it is refreshing to see a congressman who knows these issues and is as passionate about the issues as you are. You do it as well as many of those presidential candidates that I talked about. Where does your interest and background come on issues of foreign policy and national security? Why is it such a passion for you?
I don't know what it is. I mean, I grew up with it. My father was a congressman here in southern Minnesota, so I saw some of that. But when I worked for a United States Congressman, Mr. Stanglin, Arlen Stanglin, one of my duties was foreign affairs. And at a young age, I was able to go down to the White House for those briefings with Oliver North and Pat Buchanan and some of those when President Reagan was trying to defeat communism in Central America. And I guess I always taken a liking to that. But my general philosophy and viewpoint is this. If you're going to be a member of the United States Congress, your first responsibility is to defend the United States and protect the American people. Beyond that, yeah, we can do all sorts of great things. But if you don't accomplish those first goals, then we're not going to have a country. So that's why I'm so protective about making sure that the people come to the United States are going to assimilate and love our country as much as we love our country, make sure that our borders are secured, that we have a passport system that makes sense. 15 years after 9/11, we still don't have a biometric passport system. We have people overstaying visas from countries that hate America, or like on 9/11, the people from Saudi Arabia. They're roaming our country. We don't know where they are. They should be sent back because we should have a legal process. So, yeah, I think it's we just want to defend the country and make sure people are protected.
We're going to talk a little bit about the VA and veterans, but before we do, you talked a lot of veterans in your district, members of the military, National Guardsmen here in Minnesota. What are you hearing as far as what needs to be done to rebuild our military, which has seen cuts? You've got ambiguous missions, you've got morale difficulties in the ranks. What do you think needs to be done with our Pentagon or with our leadership to make sure our military is restored to what it should be?
I don't know. I think there's a little bit, you probably know this better than me, but I think there's a little bit too much political correctness right now in the military. I think the generals are afraid in many capacities to give the White House the straight story. The politics is being played. They almost know in advance what they're supposed to say, and that's happening. We have now the planes can't fly for lack of spare parts, older than the pilots. This is kind of a revisited time like we had when Carter was in office and Reagan took over. And so we need to rebuild our military. It's depleted. We also make sure that it's utilized properly around the world. Again, these are very high-level executive decisions that need to be made. I would follow the lead of the next president. Hopefully it'll be Donald Trump. Make sure we rebuild the military and do what we have to project strength and make sure we're never in a position where we have to hopefully use that military.
Well, Donald Trump got some criticism for some of the ways he articulated at the Commander-in-Chief Forum about those generals. But your point is, you don't want generals giving you answers that they feel like they need to give you. It also, what it manifests itself on the battlefield, the rules of engagement, which can be very cumbersome and put trigger pullers at more risk than they otherwise would be.
Well, I've spoken with many veterans. As a matter of fact, one of them's on our campaign. who said that the rules of engagement over in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly Afghanistan for whatever reason, so restricted that they had to get fired upon first before they could go after the enemy. If the enemy threw down their weapons, even if they were running across the field to go pick up more weapons, they just had to let the enemy go. That drones would be flying around, not to help them on the battlefield, but to keep a record in case, unfortunately, they made a mistake. So, I mean, it's like anyone else. A quarterback in a football game isn't going to be as effective if they think somebody's looking over the shoulder all the time, ready to yank them out. And I think our military, their mission needs to change, and it should be get in there, do the job. We're going to give you every benefit of the doubt. It's war. There are going to be mistakes, but we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt, and then let's get you out as fast as possible. I mean, you're a combat vet. You've seen some of these things firsthand, and I mean, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think you're right. At least be willing, when you enter a fight, enter the fight with the willingness to finish it properly. And sometimes that's going to be in and quick and out, and sometimes that's going to require a longer investment. But if you're going to invest, don't tuck tail and leave before the job is done. Otherwise, it does become an exercise that is counterproductive. And that's why I think the lesson of the Iraq War, everybody wants to say it was an inevitable disaster and a failure. No, the lesson of the Iraq War was one of resolve. We weren't winning, then we surged and added troops, and then we won. And those who were there saw it happen. Even Joe Biden, and I'm sure you know this, Joe Biden in 2010 is quoted as saying the Iraq War will be a great success for the Obama administration. They even deemed Iraq stable enough to be deemed a success. And then they, as you talk about all the time, the Status of Forces Agreement and others, they rushed for the exit. So that was longer than anyone ever wanted. But when you correct course and win, well then do what's necessary to keep the win. Otherwise, you're right. Unleash people to fight wars that are actually victories. So I think you're spot on. You talk about vets. Tim Walz is a veteran himself. Certainly thank him for his service. But in Washington, I like to say there's Minnesota Walz and then there's Washington Walz. And Washington Walz is very different from what you see here. And as a veterans advocate, I've had a chance to interact with his staff, a little bit with him in Washington. And he purports to do the right things by veterans, yet there's a lot of tough votes that he refuses to take. Lay out a little bit more about what the contrast is between how you would fight to fix the VA and what Tim Walz would try to do.
Well, I agree, and I also honor everyone's service, yours and Tim Walz's, and whoever's been in the military and served our country. I tell people, though, that this election is about not his service in the National Guard, it's about his service in the United States House of Representatives. And unfortunately, since he's been out there, he's been a foot soldier for the left wing of the Democrat Party, taking direct commands from Obama and Pelosi and the rest of them. And that's why he's going to be defeated in this election. As it turns out with veterans, the one thing my opponent said in 2006 when he was first elected 10 years ago, he said, send me out there, I'll take care of our vets. Unfortunately, that's not the record. 10 years later, the veterans are worse off today than when he went out there. And he's been working hand in hand with Obama's VA secretaries, been on the committee of jurisdiction, not getting it done. One of the things that happened last year is there's a bill called the VA Accountability Act. I know that you were a big proponent of that, and at the time, Congressman Walz voted against that, took a position against the veterans, the VFW, the American Legion, Common Sense, you name it. And that bill just simply said, 30 to 60 days, you fire and demote VA employees for misconduct whenever they screw up. We changed the civil service rules. And Tim said, no, we can't do that because it's a right to work issue for the VA workers. And I'm like, no, it's a right to life issue for our veterans. You've got it exactly wrong, Congressman. So civil service reform in the VA and across the government would be very important for me. I don't think if we're going to fire and demote people in the VA for making mistakes, we should do it at Treasury, Labor, EPA, and everywhere else because everyone in this country deserves good governance. The other thing is, let's be honest. I mean, we have a situation where at any one time, 500,000 veterans are waiting more than 30 days for care, for medical care. That's not good. That's not good enough. We've had a lot of problems. You reported on it. People dying, waiting in line for care from the VA and from the government. I think it's time that we just open it up and let every veteran go out and choose their own doctor and hospital, get the quality, timely care that they were promised, that they earned, that they deserved. And if we do that once and for all, I mean, that'll be very important. We're here in Rochester. Then we have the Mayo Clinic, the preeminent institution of medicine in all the world. And unfortunately, we have veterans who have served their country that have to drive right by the Mayo Clinic and keep going to Minneapolis or Sioux Falls or wherever, they should have the choice to get care in their hometown from their own doctors. That's what I believe.
That is what you believe in. It is absolutely correct. And no district is, as you just pointed out, I was going to say, is there a more distinct choice and option should be giving veterans to get the best quality care if it's available to them. I will say this though to the audience and everyone watching. You hear people running for office all the time say, well, this congressman had this chance or did that, and you wonder, is it true? Is it the full story? I was there at the creation of the VA Accountability Act. My organization was part of fighting for it to get it enacted in the House and the Senate. We did Vets on the Hill, and we went to Washington multiple times. We met with Republicans and Democrats and said, okay, this is a 3-page bill. It's very simple. It empowers the VA secretary with the ability to fire underperforming employees at the VA if they're not doing their job. Does that sound good? And everybody nodded their head and said, of course it does, Republicans and Democrats. Then it came to the moment of truth on the House floor when it passed through the House committee on a partisan vote, I will say, and onto the House floor. And the put up or shut up moment was clear. And at that moment, Tim Walz decided to side with the government employee unions, AFGE, over what's best for the veterans. We sat in his office. We talked to his staff. We talked to other staff. He understood the contours. This is not a side vote. This wasn't I did vote against it for another reason. This was, I want to keep the support from this critical special interest group rather than do what's necessary at a difficult time. It's not because he's a bad human being. It's because the rhetoric that he's got here is disconnected from the people he's beholden to in Washington. And it happens too often, and it shouldn't happen with our veterans. So what you're saying is true, and I've seen it. And even a bill, then they'll try to craft a new bill that's watered down so that they can vote for it. And that's what Washington always does. And Tim Walz has been a part of that too. We don't need any more of that smoke and mirrors. We need folks that'll just stand up and say, it's time for accountability, it's time for choice. And that's what I like about the contrast.
Time for solutions. I agree with that 100%. One other thing along those lines, much is brought up of suicides in the veteran community, some upwards of 22 a day. It's a terrible tragedy. Not all of them are young kids. Some of them are of the Vietnam era and so forth. But sometimes Washington thinks if they pass a bill, if they spend more money, if they hire more bureaucrats, that's somehow going to solve the problem. And I'm not so convinced that's the answer. We've gone across the district and met a lot of veterans who've spoken to this issue. One of them was John at the Rice County Fair. And he came up, he's now a Pepsi driver, he's no longer in the reserves. And I was talking with him about the solution, choose your own doctors. He said, would that count for psychiatrists too? I said, absolutely. He says, well, that's very important. So why do you say that? He said, because my friend called the VA, he said he had some psychological issues he wanted to deal with. And they said, we're kind of full up right now, call back. He went out and shot himself. I said, my friend may not have lived. We don't know. But it would have been nice if he had had the option, if he had been able to go choose his own doctor. And I talked to another fellow who was very, very close to us on the campaign, and an Afghanistan vet. He's lost limbs and really sacrificed for this country. And he said, Jim, make sure that you always give them the option to get out of the VA for psychological and PTSD and all that. Because a veteran doesn't want to go to the government and tell the government his secrets or her secrets. Because he's afraid he's going to lose his benefits, he's going to lose his weapons, he's going to lose his liberties. They need an outlet other than the government.
They deserve a choice. They fought for that very choice. No, I think you're exactly right. By the way, the position he's taking, which is entirely sensible, policy-based, and based in reality, Tim Walz, the Democrats, and others will say, Jim Hagedorn wants to privatize the VA and push veterans out into the private market because he doesn't care about it. Be ready for that. That's exactly what they will say.
They've
already tried it. Don't let them do it because it's not the case. You can do this in a way that veterans have a true choice between a VA facility in Minneapolis or the Mayo Clinic if they so choose, and they deserve that choice. We just talked a little bit about it. I wrote a book called In the Arena, which is meant to kind of inspire and motivate people to fight where they can, where they are for this great country. What has compelled you to enter the arena? Why did you decide to put your name on a ballot, which is not an easy thing to do, and run for elected office?
Well, you do it because you love the country and you love the people and you want to do what you think you can in order to help people. But in this election, and like the last one we were in, I really think we're at a defining moment in our nation's history. We're either going to win these elections and then govern with the courage of our conservative convictions, make big, bold change in Washington, D.C., St. Paul, capitals across the country, or I fear that we're going to lose our country the way it was put together by the forefathers. Much of that has to do with the Supreme Court. If Hillary Clinton is elected, she's going to replace Justice Scalia and probably one or two more, and we'll end up like California, where every good idea will just be found unconstitutional. And so I think we're at this moment where we're either going to stand up and fight and win and do what's right, or I'm afraid that we may never have the country that we grew up with.
No, certainly a lot of us that have that fear as well.